Welcome back to another scripture discovery session. We are moving along in our Proverbs series and now in chapter 7. If you have followed along with the sermon series that we're doing on Sundays, by now you have seen the discontinuity between the verses that we are preaching on Sunday morning and the scripture discovery videos, specifically on chapter 6 and chapter 7. And that's because after I made the Proverbs 6 video, our pastoral team decided to rearrange the sermons and break up chapter 6 and chapter 7. So this past Sunday, Pastor Jeff and myself preached on Proverbs chapter 6, verses 1 through 19. And then this week coming up, we're going to finish off chapter 6 and also cover chapter 7. So I apologize for not exactly following along with the sermon. I try to record these videos a week or two before they are uploaded onto our YouTube page, so I'm sure there'll be other times when this will happen as well. But I'm glad that we decided to change it up, and that's because if you remember working through Proverbs chapter 6, there is a clear transition between verses 19 and verse 20. And verse 20 starts out with this phrase, "Keep your father's commandment and forsake not your mother's teaching." Now, I think I remember mentioning that that verse is very similar to verse 8 in chapter 1, where Solomon begins his instruction. And it seemed to me, at the time at least, that you could break up that chapter 6, into two chapters because of that transition. Anyways, we're going to keep going and hit each chapter like we planned. Remember, in chapter 6, seems to change direction from the warnings of the forbidden woman to some wise social conduct. And that seems to play out all the way to verse 19. And then when we hit verse 20, we see that Solomon transitions to the warnings against adultery and the evil woman. And that leads us into chapter 7 because I think Solomon sticks to that topic. So let's begin our study now. Remember to grab a pen, pencil, and highlighter. Make sure the passage is printed out and right in front of you. And before you continue on with this study, make sure you read chapter 7 several times. And by the way, when you do that, I suggest doing it without the pen and pencil in hand. Just enjoy reading it, take in what the passage is saying, and then when you start the video and we work through this together, that's when you can start engaging with the text with your pen, pencil, or highlighter. All right, with that, let's begin. Proverbs chapter 7, verse 1, starting with the phrase, "My son, and treasure up my commandments with you." The command is to keep and to treasure up, and we're also highlighting words and commandments. Now, it seems like this is the norm when Solomon transitions. He always gives a command to keep or to take to heart or to treasure up, bind them or write them. He uses all those kinds of commands, specifically when it comes to wisdom. And of course, we see that he uses various words to communicate that point or that idea of wisdom. Here he's using words and commandments. Again, in verse 2, we see the command to keep. Keep my commands and live. Keep my teaching as the apple of your eye. Again, we're highlighting keep, highlighting commandments and teaching, and I'm underlining the word live and that phrase, apple of your eye. I think this is the first time we've ran into this phrase in Proverbs, and it basically means to keep his teaching and commandments precious, hold them dear. And I think we can make this connection, keep and treasure up, keep in verse 1 and in verse 2, and then also words and commandments, and teaching and commandments. So verse 1, he's giving the command. Verse 2, he's giving the same command in different ways, but also adding a few things, like the concept of living and these commandments and teachings being the apple of your eye. He's going to keep going. In verse 3, another command to bind them. I'm highlighting bind. I'm also going to highlight the word them. It's pointing back to the commandments and teaching. I guess we can make the connection also of bind and keep. And underline on your fingers and the command to write them. We'll do the same thing. And underline on the tablet of your heart. I'm going to circle the word heart. I don't know what color we used in the past in our previous chapters when it comes to the word heart, but I'm just going to make it red for now. And let's make sure we make the connection of write and keep and teaching and the word them. So Solomon is repeating himself for the third time. He's saying it again in different ways, and we can see the development that he's making in each of these verses. In verse 1, he's just giving the command. Verse 2, he gives the command and then brings out the call to live and how we are to value these commands and teachings, and that's as the apple of your eye. I think I'm going to mark the word as. And then in verse 3, the command again in a different way, and to bind them on your fingers. Now that's a interesting analogy. I don't know exactly what that means. It may mean something similar to the apple of your eye in the sense of keeping them close or to view them like jewelry that has great value. Put them on your fingers, of course. And again, I think we've seen this phrase in previous chapters, on the tablet of your heart. I love that picture. It brings to my mind this idea of these commands and teachings being permanent, being ingrained into my mind, and not merely just to know them, but to actually love these teachings and commands, which again seems to be expressed in verse 2 with that phrase, apple of your eye. So Solomon is pouring it on thick in verses 1 through 3. And now in verse 4, he transitions a little, and he says, say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight to your intimate friend. Say to wisdom is the command. And then here's the quote. You are my sister, end quote, and call insight your intimate friend. Call insight is the command, and intimate friend I'll underline, and underline sister. And I like these word pictures Solomon is giving us. And if there's any siblings out there listening to this, notice that a sister is being equated with valuing teaching and commandments and wisdom. So it just implies that you are to value your sisters. I just want to throw that out there just in case my children someday listen to this video. All right, let me make a few changes. I'm trying to stay consistent with verses 1, 2, and 3. All right, there we go. And I'm still going to make connections like I have done with the previous verses. All right, so keep my words, treasure up my commandments, keep my commandments, keep my teaching, bind them, write them, say to wisdom, call insight. I like that list. And this may be something where I would take a piece of paper and write out this list and reflect on it for a time. Notice that writing is involved in verse 3, writing them on the tablet of your heart. But also in verse 4, there's speaking, to say and to call out. And I guess we can ask, why is Solomon using this type of language? Man, just in the first 4 verses, there's a lot going on, I think. All right, let's keep moving. Verse 5, to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. I'm underlining that phrase to keep you and highlighting forbidden woman, also adulteress, and underlining smooth words. If you remember back to the other chapters, I think we've read about the evil men with perverse speech. In verse 6, it was crooked speech. I think in chapter 5, the adulteress or the forbidden woman had words as smooth as oil. And I think back in chapter 2, the forbidden woman had smooth words. And now we see it here again in verse 5, which makes me think Solomon is warning us against speech that will influence us in a negative way, with, of course, smooth words and crooked speech. And I guess Solomon is just warning us to be careful of what we hear and listen to. Okay, moving along, verse 6. For at the window of my house I have looked out through my lattice. I'll mark the word for, and I'm thinking this applies to all the commands that he gave. So verses 1 through 5. And it looks as though Solomon is giving us a more detailed picture and perhaps giving us a hypothetical situation or circumstance. Verse 7, and I have seen among the simple, and I have perceived among the youths, a young man lacking sense. In this verse, I think I'm just going to highlight lacking sense. Now, what does it look like to lack sense? Well, I think Solomon's going to describe this for us. Verse 8, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house. I think I'm just going to underline a few words. I don't see much here to really mark up. I'm underlining near her and her house. I would say that lacks sense. Also in verse 9, I'm wondering if twilight, evening, night, and darkness. I'm thinking this, in Solomon's eyes, lacks sense as well. So it's just not about where you go, but when you go. All right, and I hope I don't step on anybody's toes as I describe this, but when I'm reading this and seeing the descriptions Solomon is giving, I liken it to someone going out late at night to a club. I know for myself as a father, I'm not too keen on my daughters, even as they get older, to go clubbing late at night. I think there's a lot of dangers out there. Now, if they did go, daytime I would think would be far better than at night, but certainly I would be very worried if it was at night. Anyways, I'm wondering if Solomon is kind of saying the same thing. Verse 10, and behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, willy of heart. I think I'm just going to highlight the word prostitute. I know it's describing how she is dressed, but the word prostitute kind of goes alongside of the word forbidden woman and adulteress. I am going to circle heart and mark that word willy, and I don't see that word too often. Now, I thought that it meant something along the lines of not being conscious, not being intentional, not being aware of your surroundings, aware of what you're doing. But I just looked it up on Google, and the definition that first popped up is skilled at gaining an advantage, especially deceitfully. So that's a very different picture of what I had in my mind. This is the woman being very intentional and wanting to deceive the man. I think I'm also going to highlight the word woman or the woman. Again, this is still referring to the forbidden woman and the adulteress. It's the woman that's dressed as a prostitute and looking to seduce someone. She is loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. I'm underlining loud, wayward, and her feet do not stay at home. I guess I'll underline that as well. And this gives me a picture of her being a huntress, right? Going to find her prey. And I don't know what to do with that word loud. She is loud. I don't know what that means. If she's maybe trying to draw attention to herself. And I guess that is a little bit different than a huntress, right? Instead of being concealed and, stalking your prey and using the element of surprise, when it comes to the forbidden woman, the adulteress, who wants to seduce someone, she is actually the bait as well. Now, this is a very different image than how we see adulterous relationships today. At least in my mind, it seems that we often put a lot of blame on the man because he is usually the pursuer. But Solomon is shedding light on the woman's heart behind this as well. Now, I don't think it's an either or, like it's either the man who's to blame or the woman, but it's just here that Solomon is really revealing the heart behind the forbidden woman who wants to take part in adultery. Anyways, moving on, verse 12, now in the street, now in the market, and at every corner she lies in wait. I'm just going to underline that phrase, lies in wait. And then in verse 13, she seizes him and kisses him, and with a bold face, she says to him. All right, I'm going to circle the phrase seizes him and kisses him, and she says. So this forbidden woman knows what she wants, and she goes after it. Solomon is describing her as very bold. You know, it would be very interesting to get the lady's perspective of this passage. Because for myself, this is rather surprising how strong Solomon is coming off when it comes to at least the forbidden woman and the adulteress. Anyways, moving to verse 14, this is what she says. And I'm wondering if this points back to verse 5 and her smooth words. So I'm going to circle verse 14 in red and point it back to verse 5 and the phrase smooth words. All right, now let's look at what she says. I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love, for my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. I'm going to keep going. Verse 20, he took a bag of money with him. At full moon, he will come home. End quote. All right, I'm not going to highlight too much in this section except for verse 18. Let us take our fill of love and let us delight ourselves with love. I think that's what it's boiling down to, right? This is what she wants. She wants to be loved. And I guess you could say verses 14 through 20 are smooth words. She's basically saying that she thought of everything and got everything set up for a pleasurable night. And notice in 19 and 20 that she doesn't give the young man any excuse concerning her husband. She has made all the preparations to make this happen. And remember, she is saying this to the young man who is lacking sense. All right, so that's what she says. And let's look at verse 21 and how it plays out. Verse 21, with much seductive speech, she persuades him. With her smooth talk, she compels him. Of course, I'm underlining seductive speech and smooth talk, and I'm marking persuades him and compels him. In verse 22, all at once he follows her. I think I'm going to underline the phrase he follows her. This is the young man lacking sense. Here's a word picture Solomon uses. He follows her as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast. I'm going to mark that word as. This is a disturbing picture. As an ox goes to slaughter. I'm highlighting slaughter in a different red to show this picture of the consequences of falling into the hands of the seductress. All right, let me mark the word as here. As a stag is caught fast till an arrow pierces its liver. That sounds painful. Another comparison, as a bird rushes into a snare. I'm highlighting snare. I probably should highlight the phrase caught fast in verse 22. Going back to verse 23, he does not know that it will cost him his life. That's definitely a consequence. I think I'm also going to mark it this way. And for good measure, I think I'm going to put a little star next to it as well. It will cost him his life. That should put a healthy fear into every young man, the one who is lacking sense. And I guess not just young men, right? All men, and I would say women too. And I think Solomon is communicating this warning in an intense way in order to knock some sense into the one who is lacking sense. And I think this phrase does it, at least for me. It will cost him his life. That's powerful. All right, verse 24. And now, O sons, Solomon might be transitioning here, listen to me and be attentive to the words of my mouth, highlighting listen and be attentive, also highlighting words. We've seen this phrase multiple times in past chapters, to be attentive to the words of my mouth. I think it might be good to go back and try to find those phrases and see how Solomon is using them. I'm wondering if Solomon uses that phrase to prepare us for a summary. I don't know, that's something to go back and look into. All right, verse 25. Let not your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. All right, I'm just going to consider this a command. Let not your heart turn aside. I'm going to circle the word heart. The heart comes up a few times in this chapter. Of course, I'm going to mark the word ways and the word paths and highlight the command do not stray. Again, this sounds like a summary and finishing off this chapter. Verse 26, for many a victim has she laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. I'm going to mark the word for, and I think I'm going to highlight the phrase laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng, highlighting the word slain. And in verse 27, her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. Again, marking the word way, and highlighting the word Sheol and death. And I think I'm just going to point those words back to verse 23 in the phrase, cost him his life. There might be something going on there. And it looks as though it's pretty obvious that verses 24 through 27 is some kind of summary. There's definitely a transition between 23 and 24, so I'm going to mark that out. And basically what I'm doing here is trying to figure out the structure of this chapter, which will then give me the flow of thought and end with the main idea. Now, we won't get into all of that in this video, but at least we can finish coming up with a structure. So let me jump back up to the top. All right, after reading this through a couple of times, I think the first section is verses 1 through verse 9. Now in verse 1 through 5, he's giving all these commands, talking about wisdom. He's saying it in different ways. He introduces the forbidden woman in verse 5 and gives the reason why in verse 6. So I'm going to keep that all one section. And that's kind of a setup for what takes place in verse 10. All right, now, I don't know exactly how to do this next section. I think there's various ways we can break it down. Just for myself, because this is such a long section, I think I'm going to break it down into smaller sections. So verses 10 through 13 is the beginning of the scenario. And then in verse 20, we see this long monologue, and it's the forbidden woman using her smooth speech to entice this young man who lacks sense. So verses 14 through 20. And then we have verses 20 through 23. Now, if you want, you could probably make that middle section all one section, starting in verse 10 and ending in verse 23. So that's another way to do it. Again, thank you for taking the time out and engaging with this text with me. It's a very interesting text, and as I'm recording this episode, I'm not quite sure who's going to be preaching Proverbs 7. I know that I'm not, but I'm very curious to see how Pastor Rob and or Pastor Jeff preaches this passage. And also, I'm really looking forward to having discussions with you about it, Remember, we are going to talk through it on Sunday morning during our Sunday school hour, which starts at 10 a.m. at Converge Community Church. So make sure you come on down. Again, thank you for engaging. May God bless, and we'll see you next time.